on your left is an elevator that can take you down to 0, which is outside where we were, or the first floor where the water is. We are still going to do the reception outside at the back, so we'll be going out there after both of the afternoon panels, so we'll be in here the rest of the afternoon. I think there was one more thing to say. Oh, the folks downstairs that are serving coffee will continue to serve coffee through the afternoon. So between our keynote and the next panel, we can go outside, those who want to have coffee, or if you're if you're truant on a lecture and are outside, you can still get a coffee, but we don't recommend it. Stay here. So we're waiting for your computer still.
But if it doesn't show up, I might just use faith.
I'll do this. Any questions? Logistical questions you have about anything? Yes, thank you.
What is your favorite part about being in Florence?
My favorite part about being in Florence is there's a lot of things to answer. I'm trying to be, let's see. It's the people that come through. When you're first here, it's the food. When you're second here, it's the fact that there's always interesting people coming through Florence. And today is no different than that. So, with that, has she been introduced yet? Or? Okay, we'll have Upendra come and introduce our keynote speaker.
So hello all again. Thank you very much for your passage. Now we have shifted to very cool area than the hot area. So we are in the cool area, but the topic and lessons and the speeches and the presentations are going to be hot and provocative, I'm sure. Now let us welcome Professor Marissa Jackson-So as the keynote speaker of the conference today. We had a wonderful keynote yesterday evening. Now today we are going to have Professor Marissa Jackson-So. She is a professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law, holding joint appointments with the University of Richmond's program of Africana and American Studies. And Professor So teaches and writes in the areas of contracts, constitutional law, international law, human rights, post-structuralism, political economy, visual culture, and rhetoric. She earned her JD from Columbia Law School, her Master of Laws from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her BA from Northwestern University. So immediately prior to returning to academia, Professor So served as a Leadership in Government Fellow for the Open Society Foundations and a 2020 Fellow for the Fellowship Program for People of African Descent hosted by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she was an awardee of the Open Society Foundation's Fellowship Advancement Fund in 2024 and 2025. She was previously a law clerk to the late Honorable Sterling Johnson, Jr. in the Eastern District of New York, and the late Honorable Dan J. Keith on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor So's scholarship is focused on systematic human rights violations that occur in liberal democratic societies, particularly with respect to related to race, ethnicity, national origin, immigration status, gender, and ability. She considers how systems of oppression are supported by private and public law alike, and how democratic power is constructed and reconstructed through human-centered legal transformations and reforms. In addition to that, what it is here, lots of things there. We just made a very short and brief introduction here. You'll have to talk to her about her experience and wonderful intellectual thought. Please do, I encourage all of you. And one thing particularly for me is that she is one of the leading figures now who is trying to build a political economy of law and on equality kind of thing, inequality in the country, in the United States of America now. And thank you very much for taking a lead role on that one. Hopefully you'll be successful. Thank you very much, Professor Shaw. Let us give a big clap for the welcoming Professor Shaw. Thank you. You have the
Good afternoon, everyone. Is it too early to say buonasera? I don't know.
No, you're exactly right.
Okay.
You're exactly right.
It's really a pleasure. It's a very distinct and unique honor to be with you all today in the heart of Firenze at this, I think it's your 10th annual Human Rights Conference at the Gonzaga University School of Law. I just want to begin with some, thanks. I want to thank Dean Jacob Worksby, who's soon to be my dean at Richmond, Dean Jason Houston, Professor Pandacharya, for bringing us all together here for this incredibly important conference. I want to recognize my fellow speakers and moderators who have shared with us such important information yesterday and today. And certainly I want to also express my deep gratitude for everyone who was involved in the logistics and the hosting, for making everything so easy with respect to travel and just for spoiling all of us here today. Really, really appreciate it. So I was really, really delighted to learn about the theme of the conference. Of course, it's incredibly timely to be talking about executive aggrandizement right now, but I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to talk about human rights and why they matter, not only in substance, but as legal and political frameworks. So I have a background in politics. I didn't mention it in my bio, but after my first attempt to become a law professor, I was quickly recruited away to serve in the mayor's office in New York City under who was then the new mayor, Bill de Blasio, who always said he ran so that Zoran Mandani could walk, right? And in doing so, I learned a lot about, the ways in which law and politics should work together to increase civic engagement and build what I like to call transformative democratic power. And so after that, just continue to become very involved in campaigns, including presidential campaigns, albeit for failed candidates, like Elizabeth Warren, who I really thought, would have been amazing. But because of that, you're going to hear a lot about human rights in the political sense from me this afternoon. And so, with no further ado, we'll just get right into it. Over the last several years, let's maybe call it a decade, human rights framework has been called into question. I've witnessed this, particularly in my line of work as an attorney, as part of liberal left political movements, as a government official, and as a scholar, right? So I mentioned that I had tried to enter the academy before going into government service, and when I was recruited, I jumped at the opportunity because I just found out that there was absolutely no need or desire to hire any human rights scholars, right? And what I was told was, it's really not about human rights anymore. We're not really sort of doing that anymore. It's more about power, right? It's more about, can you have rights if you don't have any money? It's about, empowerment and, things that are very similar to human rights, but not using human rights language, right? More language of liberation and emancipation, right? This was the time, 2013 and 14, we had Trayvon Martin had been killed. There was a lot of activity in Ferguson. Black Lives Matter was kicking off. And for me, right, I came to that with a human rights lens, but it didn't take. And so I want to talk to you this afternoon about sort of why that was and what that's meant and how it's contributed to the problem of executive aggrandizement that has brought us all here today. So when I was working for the de Blasio administration, I will say I did not experience outright hostility to the concept of human rights, but two things had become apparent to me. So within New York City, not unlike other parts of the United States, even at the Human Rights Commission, where I actually would then leave the mayor's office to go to the New York City Human Rights Commission, so literally the Human Rights Commission, definitely only talking about human rights in terms of civil and political rights. And that has roots in sort of the United States position with respect to human rights law, the United Nations, and some of the international conventions that you've heard about earlier this morning, namely the ICCPR, International Convention on Civil Political Rights, which has been sort of privileged over the ICESCR, the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. When I was working at City Hall proper, and I was the general counsel of the mayor's office for international affairs, so my office was at UN headquarters. The emphasis, right, even though we were working on the UN headquarters at UN Plaza in New York City, the emphasis from New York City was on diplomacy and soft power. So again, not so much rights, much more talk about power. This wasn't an anti-rights posture, because we definitely wanted to show off what the mayor was doing with his own emancipatory agenda, right? We were showing off the new paid sick leave, we were showing off the universal 3K, and all of these new programs that raised the minimum wage, but the semiotics had changed, the discourse had changed, and so therefore the epistemics had changed too. We're not thinking necessarily of rights, we're thinking of power, and as was mentioned earlier today, almost political domination over the other side. So the major argument I want to make this afternoon is that now, when rights are rapidly retrenching globally, is the time to reclaim and prioritize the human rights framework. But I believe that important subthesis to advance today has to be that the abandonment of human rights to power in the first instance is a major contributing force to executive aggrandizement. The abandonment of the human rights framework in favor of one that is focused on power has anti-democratic consequences. So people's human rights vis-a-vis their governments are exactly what sustain a democracy. On the other hand, power is absolute and competitive. And then I would like to go a little further and submit to you that power is more compatible with capitalism, especially when emphasized by the political right, and that this means that talk of liberty and freedom quickly morph into deregulation, profit maximization, productivity optimization, before also making space for politics that are focused themselves on money and military might, not simply instead of people, but always eventually in spite of people. Okay? So, I don't think it would be wrong to assert that contemporary human rights law has failed. I've heard people say that to me, and I've always bristled at it, but I think I bristled at it because it's not wrong, and it hurts my feelings. After World War II, right, the human rights paradigm made very obvious sense. It was extremely useful in terms of post-war nation building, right? It had become clear then that genocide and war did not serve in the human interest. I want to repeat that again. It was clear then that genocide and war did not serve in the human interest and thus could not serve in the interests of nation states. So a human rights framework was necessary for liberal democratic regimes to flourish, just as it was also necessary for colonial territories and helpful for them to use human rights discourse to leverage their own demands for self-determination and independence from their very hypocritical liberal democratic colonial masters. And I want to say a little bit, for just a couple minutes, about that hypocrisy. rights for me but not for thee. That has been a problem that has long plagued human rights, its structures, its systems, such that many people around the world, particularly in the post-colonial world, have not been able to take human rights entirely seriously as a regime or as an institutional order. For example, and I know this will not be a surprise to, or the first time people in here have heard this, right? But watching the United States exempt itself from the jurisdiction of the ICC and sort of RUD its way. Did anybody know what RUDs are here? Right, the reservations, understanding, and declarations, which are all these carve-outs that the US applies to international human rights conventions, right? So, you know, signing on to the International Convention for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, not ratifying it ever, and also attaching all these RUDs, these addenda that say, but not the right to food, and not the right to housing, right? Such that it takes all of the tooth, all of the meat, everything out of the spirit of signing on, becoming signatory in the first place. This undermined the human rights system and made it toothless. That toothlessness became proof, has over time become proof of the framework's meaninglessness, even to the citizenry of countries who ostensibly support human rights, if only in theory. And so people have been looking elsewhere to other frameworks for improvement in the human condition. Sadly, as we're seeing now, for many people in the US and certainly beyond, certainly even here in Italy, that has meant being seduced by populism, even fascism, and anti-democratic movements. When I attended law school, and then when I first started teaching law school, it was a given. It was taken for granted that democracy was a good thing. And now I have students who tell me that maybe democracy is not good, and maybe the US is not a democracy, it's a republic, right? Watching people turn their back on the idea of democracy has been jarring. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that for many people, right, the anti-democratic urge is sort of sustained by, I'm trying to think of how to put this delicately, a belief that other voices and other communities with which they think of themselves as being in economic competition with have to be suppressed so that they can be heard. So we're no longer thinking about democratic collaboration, we're thinking about competition, right? And that's what happens when you substitute power for human rights. In the United States, many anti-Trump narratives typically will portray him as a unique and unparalleled evil, as this person who is sort of simply leading his MAGA acolytes astray, away from their good sense into moral perdition, voting against their own interests. These narratives sort of have at their root a hope that Trump is an anathema, right? That he is a blip, a freak accident, something on the fringe. But we have to challenge ourselves to be a little bit more honest. And I think we've heard some of this earlier today. In fact, a more accurate narrative is probably that Donald Trump represents the will of tens of millions of Americans who already turned their back on the rules-based order, who already turned their back on democratic governance, and who already had turned their backs on the fundamental principles of human rights law, equality, due process, things that are actually located in the US Constitution. So what that means is the Trump regime, like other authoritarian or fascist regimes around the world, is not so much cause as it is consequence. And I think that's really important to understand. So what does that mean? Well, traveling over here, I brought a book by Lauren Berlant, late great cultural theorist. It was her book, Cruel Optimism. And the idea of cruel optimism, in short, is a theory of people's hope in systems that harm them. Okay? So, it is my view, as a political economy scholar, that capitalism has always been a rival, if not an outright enemy, of human rights. But we all know that to say so in the United States is tantamount to treason, right? In the United States, democracy is linked to capitalism, and this certainly since the late 1970s, and very much certainly post-Reagan. Capitalism is largely considered to be a virtue of democracy, a symptom of democracy, and what's even more important, and I think consequential, is that a lot of people don't think about it at all. It's just a given. And since the political right has been able to capture human rights adjacent language, using words such as liberty and freedom to invoke human rights principles, while then associating capitalism with liberty and freedom, and associating a protective state with tyranny, right, and dispossession of rights, they're able to sort of capture human rights language while abandoning human rights and convincing all of us to do the same. And this is reflected very deeply, very, very profoundly in American legal infrastructure. So much so that most of us have never noticed it, even though it's hiding in plain sight. All of our law, all of our black letter law, right, privileges commerce, economic efficiency, free markets, even over anti-discrimination principles and related civil rights laws. I get to see this because I teach both private and public law. And so I teach in both contracts and in my race and constitution classes, the famous sort of Supreme Court landmark case of Shelley versus Kramer, decided in 1948, wherein the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that while private racial discrimination in the form of restrictive housing covenants was permissible, what was not permissible was the government enforcement of those housing covenants. What does that mean in layperson's language? So neighborhoods, including neighborhoods that I used to live in Baltimore, there would be deeds in the neighborhood that said, do not sell your house to Negroes or Jews, right? And what the court said in its analysis and its holding was that we don't actually have a problem with that. That's free market stuff. That's freedom right there. That freedom to discriminate, that's what makes us American. That's great. That makes America great. What we can't do is enforce it as the government. And so you sort of are playing, you know, there's a two-faced nature, right? This hypocrisy that I'm talking about. There's a two-faced nature where the Supreme Court is managing inequality, but it's never eradicating inequality, right? Because it associates inequality with freedom, right? And then there is the infamous 1971 Powell memo. Some of you may have heard about this, some of you may never have heard about this. It's a memo that was drafted by a corporate lawyer by the name of Lewis Powell, who would eventually go on to be a justice of the Supreme Court, sent to the US Chamber of Commerce. In this memo, Lewis Powell urged US businesses to aggressively counter the civil rights movement, to aggressively counter women's rights, racial justice, voting rights, through lobbying, through media campaigns, and through the funding of conservative think tanks. That memo is largely credited with the founding of such organizations as the Heritage Foundation, right, which of course gave us Project 2025. And so, even where the language of our law speaks to due process, anti-discrimination, equal protection of the laws, protections against cruel and unusual punishment, deeper in the infrastructure, are messages that run completely counter to that, right? And which privilege corporate power, patriarchy, white supremacy, and other things that are fundamentally contrary to what we think of as contemporary human rights norms. So I've already made the case that the popular abandonment of human rights has facilitated, right, the current political moment we're in, and the ability of the executive to consolidate power, right? Right now, speaking specifically for the US, we have a court that does the executive's bidding. We've got a legislature that's doing the executive's bidding. And what this has resulted in is a rapid, not just a retrenchment, but a rapid rights abolition. Through an incredible number of executive orders, we heard about this morning, and the establishment of a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, the Trump administration has been able to significantly shift the nation's political economy while also materially breaching the terms of that post-World War II social contract that I was talking about before. We've seen reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, voting rights, remedial racial justice measures, Chevron deference, which actually gives us workplace safety. Rights to privacy have been dealt death blows. Racial profiling is now constitutional. Due process is no longer guaranteed. The right to asylum is all but gone. Birthright citizenship potentially on the chopping block. Legislators have also introduced measures intended to suppress the votes of women. They've also introduced measures to lower the legal working ages and hours of work for Black and brown teenagers in the Deep South. There have been measures in state legislatures to lower the marriage age, to what I consider to be unconscionable ages. All of this in the service of ensuring the dominance of some people over others. I would say that many of the tens of millions of Americans who are supporting rising authoritarianism through the Trump administration believe that human rights repression is necessary for them to experience economic prosperity, right? This idea that the immigrants are taking our jobs, right? Or women need to go back to the home so that men can be, I don't know, true men. Whatever it is you guys are doing. This comes from a visceral realization and understanding, even if it's never articulated, that capitalism is a system that produces winners and losers. So many people are believing that human rights retrenchment will position people like them as winners and people like those other people as losers, right? And that's the bet that they're making. The cruel optimism comes in because those people are being sorely disappointed. Not only are they not suddenly more manly, they can't afford to fill up the tanks of their cars, right? The people who have been deported without due process, turns out they were their relatives, their neighbors, their wives. And so now that buyer's remorse seems to be just a little too late. And maybe it's too late to do anything about it because the executive is already so big. So if that's the case, what are we to do? Are we doomed? It kind of feels like we're doomed. But I'm an eternal optimist, not a cruel optimist, a benevolent optimist. I know that human rights are hard to come by. And I know that they're easy to lose. And I know that they're very difficult to retrieve in the face of a dictatorship. We heard already about the ruling of Louisiana versus Calais, which basically gutted the rest of the Voting Rights Act. And we've seen the rapid speed at which Deep South legislatures in the United States have moved to erase all black, all black representation in legislatures, with the help of the court, because typically when the Supreme Court makes a ruling like that, it takes about 28 days for it to go into effect. And on this case, for reasons not explained, the Supreme Court allowed it to go into immediate effect. I live in Virginia, and we had a special election on April 21st to do the exact same thing, to also redistrict, but to create more Democratic districts as opposed to Republican districts. So the exact same thing that the Deep South legislatures are doing with the permission of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has been telling us, right, if you want rights, take it to the polling booth, right? We can't give you rights. We don't do that, right? You got to vote it out. So we voted it out in Virginia, and the measure to redistrict in favor of the Democratic Party won. Immediately challenged. Virginia Supreme Court shoots it down. We sent it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court shut it down without explanation, even though that's in direct contradiction to the Louisiana versus Calais ruling less than a month ago. So, I've kind of abandoned my slides, I'm sorry. Well, I think this is actually where we are though, right? If your rights were not important, people wouldn't try to get rid of them, right? I want to sort of, in the service of optimism, say, to quote a great person, yes, we still can, if we're quick, right? So, I've talked a lot about the people who have been questioning democracy and sort of souring on human and civil rights, hoping to find solace and power in authoritarianism. But let's be real, there are other groups of people like that out there too. And those are the people who I actually want to spend the rest of my time talking about, because they're the people who I find the most interesting. While they're likely to be disconnected from human rights discourse, they are at core human rights believers. They just call themselves a bunch of other things. Abolitionists, progressives, social democrats, democratic socialists, organizers, base builders, advocates for working people, and on and on and on, all kinds of labels. And there's much that these people would probably disagree with each other about. Some of them are like, vote blue no matter who. And some of them are like, no, neoliberal shill, loser, right? There's all kind of that stuff. But what they have is a strong desire to protect people from exploitation, to preserve civil liberties, to eliminate poverty, and to secure living wages for people. And of course, it destroys systems of depression. And so I think there is room for hope. I think a lot of that work is being done already. But I think there's something we've got to do differently this time. Okay, I think we have to reimagine our human rights governance. So, the way that the human rights institutional order came to be is not going to save us. I do think we can save ourselves, and I do think that human rights are going to be key. I think that human rights discourse, a reclaiming of human rights, is going to be important. But this time, could we have all the rights, please? Right? Not just the civil and political, but also the economic, right? Also the social, also the cultural. A little bit of the environmental, please, right? Because what has been missing is, you're telling me I can have rights, but I'm hungry, right? You're telling me I can vote. I don't have time to vote. I have 3 jobs. And so we're going to have to sort of decolonize our idea of rights. We're going to have to be holistic when we talk about human rights. And we're going to have to let the people who are most vulnerable make the calls. And I think we heard that a little bit about that before lunch. So what does that mean for us here today as law students, as legal scholars, as community members, as law school administrators? Well, I think one thing that we can do now is start becoming more human rights literate. Right? I think that human rights have to be mainstreamed in our curricula and in the ethos of legal education. Human rights can't just be a class that's over there. It's got to be mainstreamed into all of our classes, whether that's contracts, torts, criminal law, and what have you. When we're talking about the rule of law, when we're talking about democratic governance, when we're talking about freedom of commerce and freedom of contract, we can talk about that using a human rights framework, right? And a human rights epistemology. And so if we're able to do that, then all of a sudden, we're not talking about contracts just as business, but we're talking about contracts as an expression of human agency. We're talking about contracts as like sort of the right to exchange with each other. We're talking about criminal law, right, as a way that the state uses to regulate, right, violations of people's human rights, right? So right now when you take criminal law, right, you're thinking about cases like the state versus so-and-so. But what does that mean, right? That is what the state is saying is, hey, you broke our social contract. You overstepped and you harmed somebody, right? So it's about sort of small things that we can do pedagogically that will help us all become more literate in terms of human rights and more prepared to fight the good fight. I believe we're going to have to sort of embrace the state. The state has been demonized, but we have to embrace a protective state if we're going to make human rights matter. I think we're going to have to move beyond rugged individualism and explore collectivity, communal well-being, restorative, reparative justice. Because one of the human rights principles that I think is most important is that human rights are interrelated, indivisible, right? You can't have one without the other. And when you take away one, you're undermining sort of the whole entire social contract. But then I think that we have some really good news. And I'll sort of wrap up here. There are people who are already doing that work, and there are people who have already been elected to do that work. So, you see the people's mayor over there, Mr. Mamdani over there. And this is not a partisan pitch. But when he campaigned expressly on making life easier, making life better for people in New York City. It's only been a few months, we'll see what happens. But as an example of something he's doing is he's taking the ICESCR seriously by implementing city-run grocery stores, right? That are gonna have lower prices, right? They're gonna force the other grocery stores to become more competitive with those lower prices, right? A lot of the discourse from the grocery stores are like, oh my God, that's anti-capitalist, that's bad for business, right? And that is deeply rooted in who we've been as Americans, who we've been as neoliberals for the last 50 years. But what's actually happening is that the message on the ground, the reaction on the ground has been overwhelmingly positive, right? No one thought he was going to be elected. He was elected with a mandate, right? There is energy there for that type of protection, right? People do want to be treated better. They want to have better housing accommodations. They want to be safe. This woman on the left is the Prime Minister of Barbados. Her name is Mia Amor Motley. And she's been in office for, several years. And if you are sort of in the United Nations milieu, you know her because she's a force when it comes to defending small islands with respect to climate change, right? And trying to make sure that the big states do their fair share to protect the small countries. Like Zoran, she's probably running a more of a progressive government. And she has been very, very outspoken about the fact that her government is a human rights-focused government. Right? And she's a leader in the global sphere. These are just two examples. There are people all over the place, right? All throughout the United States, indeed all around the world, who have a human rights-based approach to governance. There are people who support these folks. And I think I would submit to you sort of in closing is that it doesn't actually have to be partisan, right? It's about transformative democracy. It's about human well-being and collective human self-actualization, right? It recognizes that we're only as strong as our environment is. It recognizes that human rights is both universal and culturally responsive, that those are not either or conversations, but both and conversations. It recognizes that the government has responsibilities to the citizens and not the other way around. It recognizes that elected officials owe responsibilities to their constituents. It's not constituents that owe loyalty to political parties and elected officials. And I think that if we can start to sort of mainstream that, right, in our personal and our political lives, then we'll actually be able to challenge ourselves to look for that even in our law school casebooks. We'll be able to demand that kind of literacy of our professors and our scholars, and sort of work towards sort of a better understanding of how law, practice, legal theory can embrace human rights once again, but in a way that works for all of us in what I think is going to be a really, really critical moment. And I hope it won't be the last opportunity, but certainly a very important opportunity to recreate democracy. And thereby actually be able to sort of experience that freedom and liberty that we've been promised for half a century. So with that, I look forward to your comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marissa Jackson-So, for a wonderful keynote presentation and your speech. Yet again, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Ruxby, for bringing such a great speaker, wonderful speaker, with all the challenging ideas and analysis to the status quo and the consequences and results of so-called Western liberalism. Thank you very much. Of course, we are in the country of Gramsci. That is where we can talk about executive aggrandizement against the fascism of Mussolini and Gramscian analysis and writings against that. What can be that so much? Reminded me of Gramsci. Thank you very much. And now, any other questions to Professor So from the audience, please?
Thank you so much for your presentation. You used a phrase that power has replaced human rights, or might has replaced human rights. I thought that was a wonderful phrase. But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what went wrong in a certain case study, South Africa. In 1993, Nelson Mandela was hailed as the sort of the global embodiment of human rights when he was voted president and the old apartheid system collapsed. Here we are 30 years later in South Africa, to say the least, is a great disappointment with the corruption, etc. So my question is about your phrase, which I really liked, might has replaced, or power has replaced human rights. Is that phrase adequate and equally applied along racial lines to leaders who are of many different races? Is it something in human nature that makes us gravitate towards power instead of human rights? And what went wrong there? The other phrase you used that I like very much was a phrase about capitalism, but I'll give you the definition that I ran across a couple of weeks ago about capitalism. I thought it was the best definition I ever read. It said, and I hope I get it correctly, capitalism is the best system ever created to create wealth. However, it is the worst system ever created to distribute wealth fairly. I thought that nailed it, especially when you consider the great inequality between those who do the work and those who are investors, etc., etc. But thank you very much for the very interesting session.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the stories, and I say stories intentionally, I think the stories of South Africa are plural. They're many and they're multi-layered. Right now, right, as we're speaking, there's severe unrest in South Africa because of, right, sort of anti-immigrant movements, right? And this is sub-Saharan African on sub-Saharan African violence. People from countries like Nigeria and Ghana, Cameroon have come to South Africa looking for work. And much like here, in the United States, certainly here as well, the discourse has been that these migrants are taking all of our jobs. You have to look at sort of the root of that, because that's a deflection. They're using the migrants as scapegoats. What I think is actually happening is that in South Africa, it's not so much that the power is taking over the rights, it's that the rights never replaced the original power, right? Apartheid went away formally, but if you go to South Africa, you could see, I can't even call them vestiges. It just, not much has changed. The small minority of people who owned all the land and sort of dominated the economy continue to do so. And so, like you're saying, the wealth was never distributed, and so what you have is poor people fighting each other over crumbs, right? And so I think that's important to understand, particularly when you sort of invoke right things like corruption, right? And that corruption is so real, and that corruption is about maintaining a stronghold on the money. Since Nelson Mandela, sort of time as leader, but there have been so many sort of workers' rights movements and uprisings in South Africa, right? The workers are still treated terribly, right? Miners are still dying, still being trapped, being shot at for protesting, things like that. So my take on South Africa is that, much like the United States, that full reconstruction, that full democratic reconstruction of society never actually really materialized. And I think that's what leads us to have the continuity of problems that we have today. So while you may have people with black and brown skin in leadership, right, a lot of that is symbolic at best. But the old system really has not gone away. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Any other questions?
My name is Audrey. You had mentioned during your lecture that it is not uncommon for human rights to be suppressed or weakened to further economic growth, particularly capitalism in America. However, Shelley v. Kramer demonstrated an ideology of allowing or even supporting discrimination in the private market, despite not allowing the government to do so. My question is, what are your opinions on how the favoring of our capitalist economy over human rights has allowed many states to continue to allow involuntary servitude, slavery, to exist as an exception to the 13th Amendment in the incarceration system, though Shelley v. Kramer supposedly condemned government discrimination given the disproportionality of minorities in prisons?
I love that question. So one of the great deceptions of U.S. anti-discrimination law is sort of selling us equality instead of equity. So when you have that carve out in the 13th Amendment that allows for involuntary servitude, which is slavery, what you'll be told is, oh no, that's not discrimination because anyone who is imprisoned can be made to work without pay. But we know structurally that not everyone is going to prison. It's the people who were formerly enslaved, their descendants are continuing to be funneled into prison. And the problem is getting worse because prison is so profitable, right? So prison is an incredibly big business, and it's gotten even bigger with the current war on immigrants, right? So if you're able to sort of scapegoat the immigrant and convince people that they should be detained or deported, you can hold them in Dilley Detention Center and never deport them because it's more profitable to keep them on the U.S. territory in Dilley Detention Center. That is feeding the surrounding town, right? Providing good American jobs holding slaves in the United States, right? And so, to answer your question sort of more squarely, right? When I was talking about that sort of American hypocrisy, like that is for me peak hypocrisy to tell us that, oh no, anybody who's in prison, it's not about race, anybody who's imprisoned has to work for free. Okay, let's just put the slavery as bad aside for a moment. They're playing in your face because they're targeting certain communities of people for detention and incarceration, and not truly because people did anything necessarily morally wrong, but because it makes a lot of money for corporations that have invested in the industrial complex.
Thank you. I will have one more question, and please, if you have any questions, it is a great opportunity to get connected with Professor So and talk to her during the break and after the break. I would like to get it done by 3:45 as it is scheduled. Thank you. Last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'll try and keep my question brief. My name is Denise. I'm a professor of philosophy here, and I really, really appreciated your talk and all the talks today. You mentioned something that I think is really important for a question about the human rights discourse as a historical discourse. So I guess my question for you is the discourse and what it emerges out of. Do you believe it has ever been decolonized at any point in its history? Do you think there was a moment in which we could say decolonization of the very discourse itself happened because the backdrop of human rights has been in discussion with colonial regimes that have never been broken, whether it's apartheid South Africa, Steve Biko murdered in jail, was an opponent of Mandela's discussing decolonizing the mind. There's, whether it's Brazil, and that lineage of colonization has never been broken. Portugal still receives royalties for any property sold in the center of Rio. Like, the decolonizing project all these discussions around human rights, do you sense that there was a point where, as a historical discourse, we could say decolonization began, attempted? Has it shown up for you at some point in a very distinct way?
I love that question. I think the answer is whose human rights framework, who's being centered in that conversation. If we're talking about Western human rights, human rights itself is a colonial project. I think that's why people have rejected it and prefer to talk about things like liberation or other emancipatory frameworks. Why I perhaps naively cling to human rights is because the West is not my center. I live here, I grew up in the West, but my people are not from the West. My family's from Jamaica. There are people, right? There are people who occupy the subaltern, right? The great majority of people who sustain, right, the colonial masters and the neo-colonial masters, we have always had our own systems of freedom, liberation, human rights. We've always had our own senses of human rights. Those stories have not been told. They have not been included in mainstream history. That does not mean that they don't exist, right? And so, for me, when I talk about decolonizing human rights, I am saying, and perhaps I should be more clear, I'm saying that's a you problem. That's something that the West has to do, because I already know what's right. I'm waiting for y'all to catch up, right? And so I think it's just very important to assert that, right, the Euro-American project is not my center. It is not an arbiter of value for me. I do not look up to it. I do not aspire to it. I am hoping that we can catch up to what the rest of the world already knows about justice.
Thank you very much, Professor Soul, and all of you. And because of all the cooperation, Speaker Keith, the prominent key speaker, and the audience, we are exactly done in 3:45. We are still in Italy, and we can still be getting done on time. Thank you. Oh, 4 o'clock, we all will be back here, 15 minutes break, and then after 4 o'clock, there is a